At my brother's military award ceremony, my father pointed at me with his bourbon glass and laughed. "That's my daughter," he told the people sitting around our table. Then he gave that little shrug of his. "Well, family by name only. You know how she is." A couple people chuckled politely. One woman looked down into her wine glass like she suddenly found it fascinating. I just sat there smiling. That's the thing people misunderstand about humiliation when it comes from family. Most of the time, it isn't loud. It's casual, comfortable, like they've been doing it so long they don't even notice anymore. The ballroom at the Hilton Norfolk was packed that night. Navy officers in dress uniforms, retired chiefs with silver hair and old stories, city officials, defense contractors, local reporters. The kind of crowd my father loved. The windows overlooked the Elizabeth River, and every few minutes you could see lights from the shipyard moving through the darkness outside. Norfolk always smells faintly like salt water and diesel fuel after sundown. Doesn't matter how fancy the hotel is. I'd arrived early, hoping to stay unnoticed. That was my first mistake. I was wearing my service dress blues under a dark navy trench coat buttoned all the way to my throat. I'd left the ribbons and decorations minimal on purpose. Some events turn into competitions disguised as handshakes. I was too tired for that. I'd flown in from Coronado that morning after 40 straight hours dealing with a classified operations review. I barely slept on the plane. My lower back was killing me from sitting too long, and my coffee from Reagan National had tasted like boiled pennies. All I wanted was to sit quietly through my brother's ceremony and leave. But my father never did quiet well. Hank Miller had retired from the Navy 22 years earlier, yet somehow still managed to enter every room like somebody was supposed to announce him first. He was already holding court at the center table when I arrived. "Jess," he barked across the ballroom. "Well, I'll be damned. Thought your mysterious government job forgot how calendars work." A few men around him laughed immediately. Old Navy habit. Laugh when the loudest man does. I walked over, kissed his cheek, nodded at a few familiar faces, and sat down near the end of the table. Mark was seated beside our father in his dress whites. He looked good, older than 42 somehow, even though he was only 38. Tired around the eyes, leaner than the last time I saw him. He smiled when I sat down, but it faded fast. "You made it," he said quietly. "Wouldn't miss it." He nodded once, then looked away. That should have told me something right there. The event was for a rescue operation in the Arabian Sea 6 months earlier. Official details were still mostly classified, but enough had been released for the Navy League and half the state of Virginia to celebrate it publicly. Mark's unit had extracted 3 civilian contractors after a vessel fire during a storm. Good men had nearly died out there. Whatever happened later, I never forgot that part. Waiters moved through the ballroom carrying steaks and glasses of Cabernet. Somebody at another table started telling a story about a destroyer deployment in '91, loud enough for half the room to hear. Normal military banquet stuff. Then my father started in on Mark. "That boy was born for this," he told a retired rear admiral sitting across from us. "Even as a kid, tough as nails." Mark stared down at his water glass. "You remember that football championship at Pensacola Catholic," Dad continued. "Played with a busted shoulder and still scored twice." "Dad." "No, let me brag on you tonight," Hank said. Then he turned toward me. "And Jessica here," he smirked. "Well, she was always the quiet one." I felt my stomach tighten immediately. You learn to recognize incoming fire after enough years. Dad lifted his bourbon slightly toward the group. Never knew what to do with herself. Hides behind paperwork somewhere for the government. A few awkward laughs. Then came the line. My daughter, he said. Family by name only. He said it lightly, like a joke. That almost made it worse, because suddenly I was 14 again, standing in our kitchen while my father told one of his friends right in front of me that I was too sensitive for military life. I was 18 again at Great Lakes Naval Station, looking around for him at graduation, while everybody else hugged their families. He never came. Mark had a playoff game that weekend. Funny what stays with you. I kept smiling because older women especially learn how to survive rooms like that. You smooth things over. You swallow the sharp edges. You become easy to sit beside. And honestly, part of me still wanted my father to like me. At 53 years old, 4 stars on my shoulders, still wanted it. That's the embarrassing truth nobody talks about. Across the ballroom, I noticed the event coordinator speaking urgently with the master of ceremonies near the stage. A few people glanced toward me. I ignored it. Dad leaned back in his chair, looking pleased with himself. She got her mother's quiet streak, he said. In the Navy, silence usually means somebody's standing behind a desk. The retired admiral across from him gave me a polite smile. What exactly do you do, Jessica? Before I could answer, the ballroom lights dimmed slightly. The announcer stepped onto the stage, holding a gold folder. Ladies and gentlemen, he said warmly, before tonight's commendation presentation, we'd like to recognize a distinguished guest joining us this evening. Something in Mark's expression changed instantly. He looked sick. Then I knew. The announcer smiled toward our table. Please welcome Admiral Jessica Miller, Commander of Naval Special Warfare. The room went dead quiet. I heard silverware stop moving. Somewhere behind me, a chair scraped hard against the floor. My father didn't move, didn't blink. I slowly stood from my chair and unbuttoned my trench coat. When I opened it, the 4 silver stars on my shoulders caught the ballroom lights immediately. Nobody at our table breathed. One donor near the front actually whispered, Jesus Christ. My father's bourbon glass trembled slightly in his hand. Mark stared at me like he wanted to apologize for 20 years in one sentence, but there wasn't time. The announcer extended his arm toward the stage. I folded my trench coat over my chair, carefully straightened my jacket cuffs, and started walking through the ballroom. No dramatic music, no speech, just silence following me, table by table. And for the first time in my life, my father looked at me like he had absolutely no idea who I was. I've spent most of my adult life walking into rooms where people suddenly stood up straighter after hearing my rank. That night in Norfolk was the first time I could remember wanting to disappear after it happened. The applause started slowly. Military crowds are funny that way. They take a second to recalibrate when reality changes in front of them. Then everybody rose. Somebody near the front table started clapping first, then the rest followed. A few officers I recognized from D.C. nodded respectfully as I passed. One Marine general actually looked amused, like he'd just witnessed the opening scene of a very expensive movie. Meanwhile, my father sat frozen beside his untouched steak. I didn't look at him again on my way to the stage. I couldn't, because if I did, I honestly wasn't sure whether I'd laugh or cry. The master of ceremonies shook my hand a little too enthusiastically. Admiral Miller, thank you for joining us. Happy to be here. That was a lie, but a polite one. I stepped behind the podium and looked out over the ballroom. Crystal chandeliers, white tablecloths, Norfolk Harbor lights glowing through the glass behind everyone, and my father sitting perfectly still for once in his life. "Good evening," I said. My voice sounded calm. Years of command training will do that for you. You can feel like your chest is cracking open and still sound steady enough to brief Congress. "I know tonight is about honoring courage and teamwork," I continued, "and I'm grateful to be part of recognizing the sailors who served during that rescue operation." Simple, professional. No revenge speech, no dramatic pause. I thanked the families, mentioned the strain military life places on marriages and children, talked briefly about the reality that most Americans only see the ceremony side of service, not the missed birthdays or deployment calls at 2 a.m. People listened, not because I outranked them, because I meant it. When I finished, the applause felt warmer than before, real. As I stepped away from the podium, I caught sight of my father again. He looked confused. Not angry yet, just confused. Like he'd somehow wandered into the wrong story. The ceremony paused while staff reset the stage for the award presentation later in the evening. Waiters came through carrying coffee and dessert trays. Somebody's phone rang briefly before getting silenced. I slipped away toward the side hallway outside the ballroom. I needed air. The hallway overlooked the river through tall windows, and for a minute, I just stood there listening to muffled conversation from inside the banquet room. That's when the memories started creeping in. Funny how humiliation does that. Not the big moments, the small ones. I remembered being 13 years old at our kitchen table in Pensacola, trying to show my father a science award I'd won. He barely looked at it before asking where Mark was. I remembered my first week at the Naval Academy prep school. Dad had called to ask how football conditioning was going. I had to remind him I wasn't Mark. Worst one, though. Great Lakes, basic training graduation. February wind blowing straight off Lake Michigan. Again, hard enough to cut through wool gloves. Families everywhere holding signs and crying and taking pictures. I kept checking the doors looking for Dad. He never showed. Later, he called and explained Mark had an important regional playoff game. "Your brother needed support too," he'd said. At 19, I told myself that sounded reasonable. At 53, it sounded pathetic. A server walked past me carrying empty champagne glasses. "You okay, ma'am?" "Long night," I said. He smiled knowingly. "Those military dinners usually are." I laughed quietly at that. He wasn't wrong. Back inside the ballroom, I could hear my father's voice again. Even through closed doors, Hank Miller somehow projected like a stadium announcer. I stayed where I was. A few minutes later, my phone buzzed softly in my jacket pocket. One text message. "Mark, you didn't tell him." I stared at it for several seconds, then typed back, "Never seemed important." That also wasn't entirely true. The truth was uglier. Part of me wanted my father to discover it exactly this way. Not because I planned some grand revenge. I didn't. But after 30 years of being treated like background noise, some bitter little corner of my heart wanted him shocked just once, wanted him embarrassed. I'm not proud of that part, but it's honest. I slipped my phone away and leaned against the wall. That's when I heard heels clicking softly down the hallway. An older woman approached, carrying a small black purse and reading glasses in one hand. Late 60s, maybe. Sharp posture. Navy posture. Even retired personnel keep it. "Admiral Miller?" "Yes, ma'am." She smiled faintly. "Linda Carver." The name sounded vaguely familiar. I worked personnel administration years ago out of Norfolk, she said. Your father probably wouldn't remember me, but I remember him. Something in her tone made my stomach tighten immediately. We stepped farther down the hallway, away from the ballroom entrance. Linda lowered her voice. I debated whether to say anything tonight. About what? She hesitated, then looked directly at me. Your brother's medal. For a second, I honestly thought she meant there had been some mistake with the ceremony schedule. But then she continued. First, there's something you deserve to know. She folded her arms lightly. Years ago, after your mother passed, your father told several people in personnel circles you were emotionally unstable. I blinked once, not because I didn't believe her, because I did, completely. Linda sighed. Nothing formal enough to damage your record, but enough gossip to make people cautious around your name early on. A strange calm settled over me, like finally finding the missing piece to a puzzle you stopped trying to solve years earlier. Suddenly, certain stalled recommendations and awkward interviews from my 20s made a little more sense. He said he was worried about you, Linda added carefully. I almost laughed. That sounded exactly like Hank. Cruelty wrapped inside concern. Then Linda glanced back toward the ballroom doors. But that's not why I came over tonight. Her voice dropped even lower. The story being told about your brother's rescue mission isn't completely accurate. I felt every muscle in my shoulders tighten. What do you mean? Linda opened her purse slowly and removed a folded set of copied documents. Operational summaries, witness statements, names blacked out in places. One name wasn't blacked out. Petty Officer Elena Ruiz. Linda looked at me carefully before speaking again. Your brother served honorably, Admiral, but he wasn't the sailor who made the critical call during that operation. The ballroom applause erupted suddenly behind the doors as another speaker finished inside. But standing there in that quiet hallway overlooking the Norfolk harbor, I had the strange feeling the real ceremony was only beginning. For a few seconds, I just stared at the papers in Linda Carver's hands. The hallway suddenly felt colder. Inside the ballroom, somebody started laughing loudly near the stage. Glasses clinked, chairs moved across carpet. Normal sounds, ordinary sounds. Meanwhile, my entire night had quietly tilted sideways. Linda handed me the documents carefully. These are copies, she said. I kept them because something about the review process bothered me at the time. I flipped through the pages. Operational summaries, after-action notes, medical timelines. Most of the sensitive details were blacked out, but there was enough left to understand the structure of what happened during the rescue mission, and enough to see one thing very clearly. Petty Officer Elena Ruiz had made the call that stabilized 2 injured civilians while coordinating extraction under fire, not Mark. I looked up slowly. Where did these come from? Original recommendation package drafts, Linda answered, before revisions. Revisions by who? She hesitated. That part I can't prove, which told me plenty. I leaned against the window beside us and read through the pages again. Mark's name appeared throughout the operation. He absolutely served during the mission. Nobody had invented his involvement, but the wording had shifted. Little things, strategic things. Led, directed, primary decision maker. Language matters in military citations. A few adjusted sentences can completely reshape who history remembers. I exhaled slowly through my nose. Does Mark know? Linda gave me a tired look. I think your brothers spent years trying not to know certain things about your father. That one hit harder than I expected, because it sounded true. The ballroom doors opened briefly as two men in suits walked out, laughing about golf scores. They nodded politely at me before disappearing toward the elevators. The second the hallway cleared again, I pulled my phone from my pocket. Linda raised an eyebrow. "You're working already?" "I'm verifying before I react." She smiled faintly. Good answer. I stepped farther down the hallway near the windows overlooking the harbor and made a secure call through Navy channels. No drama, no threats, just process. That's what civilians sometimes misunderstand about senior command positions. Real authority usually sounds boring. Calm voices, careful wording, quiet decisions that change lives. Within 20 minutes, I had confirmation from Naval Personnel Command that portions of the operational recognition package had indeed been altered during later review stages. Not illegally, not enough for court-martials or headlines, just enough political pressure and institutional favoritism to reshape credit. Classic human behavior in a dress uniform. By the time the call ended, I felt exhausted in a way sleep couldn't fix. Linda studied my face carefully. "You okay, Admiral?" "No," I said honestly, "but thank you for telling me." She nodded once. "I knew your mother years ago." Her expression softened. "She'd be proud of you tonight." That nearly broke me, right there in the hallway. Not the revelation, not my father. That sentence. Because I honestly couldn't remember the last time somebody said those words to me and meant them. Linda squeezed my arm lightly before heading back toward the ballroom. I stayed behind another minute, staring out at the water. Then I texted Mark, "Me need to talk now." His response came almost immediately. Mark's service hallway near kitchen. I found him standing beside stacked catering trays and industrial coffee dispensers behind the ballroom. Amazing how glamorous military ceremonies stop looking glamorous once you walk through the wrong door. Mark looked terrible. His collar was slightly loose now, and sweat darkened the edge of his white uniform shirt despite the air conditioning. He already knew. I could tell instantly. He glanced toward the papers in my hand and closed his eyes briefly. "Dad talked to you first?" he asked quietly. "No." That surprised him. Then he saw the copied reports. His shoulders dropped. Oh, God. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Kitchen staff pushed carts past us without paying attention. Somewhere nearby, silverware crashed into a plastic tub. Finally, I asked the question directly. "How much of the citation is inaccurate?" Mark rubbed both hands across his face. The operation happened exactly how they said. The fire, the extraction, everything. But he swallowed hard. Elena made the medical call. I said nothing. Mark leaned back against the wall. One contractor had burns and smoke inhalation. Another guy flatlined for almost 40 seconds during extraction prep. Communications were a mess. We were taking waves over the deck. He stared down at the floor. Elena kept everybody alive. "And your citation says you coordinated the rescue." "I coordinated perimeter security." The honesty in his voice made this even worse somehow. Not because he lied, because he sounded ashamed. I folded the papers slowly. "Did Dad pressure people?" Mark laughed bitterly. "When doesn't Dad pressure people?" That's not an answer. He looked up at me then, eyes exhausted. You know how he is with veterans groups around here. Navy League donors, retired officers. Everybody owes everybody favors. He shook his head. At first, it was just speeches and introductions. Then, suddenly, I'm hearing things like legacy family and Miller tradition. I stayed quiet. Mark's voice dropped lower. I told him Elena deserved more recognition. What did he say? Mark gave a humorless smile. He said, "This was finally our family's moment." That sentence sat between us like something rotten. Not your moment, not the team's moment, the family's, meaning his. Mark looked away toward the kitchen doors. You know the worst part? What? I didn't even want the attention anymore. That surprised me. He laughed softly to himself. Sounds stupid, right? No. He nodded slowly. When we were kids, Dad always looked at me like I was carrying the family name somewhere important. He glanced at me carefully. And he looked at you like he was waiting for you to disappoint him. I said nothing, because there wasn't anything useful to say. Mark reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out the metal case. He stared at it for several seconds before holding it out toward me. I don't think I earned this version of it. I didn't take it. Not yet. Why didn't you stop this? His eyes reddened slightly. Because disappointing Dad always felt worse than disappointing myself. That one landed deep. Deeper than either of us expected. For the first time all night, I stopped seeing my brother as the golden child and started seeing another survivor of the same house, just shaped differently. I finally accepted the metal case from his hand. It felt heavier than it should have. From the ballroom, applause erupted again as another speaker finished. Mark glanced toward the sound. They're about to call everybody back up. I nodded once, then looked at him carefully. Do you want to fix this? Fear crossed his face immediately. Real fear. Not career fear. Family fear. Because somewhere inside him, a 12-year-old boy still needed our father's approval too. Finally, he whispered, Yeah. I looked toward the ballroom doors, where our father was probably still charming donors and retired officers, like the proud architect of some perfect military family legacy. For the first time in my life, I realized I no longer cared whether protecting his image destroyed me. And weirdly enough, that felt peaceful. By the time Mark and I walked back toward the ballroom, the ceremony had already moved into the final presentation segment. Neither of us spoke. We didn't need to. The hallway carpet muffled our footsteps while waitstaff hurried past, carrying coffee urns and dessert trays. Somewhere inside the ballroom, a speaker was thanking sponsors for their continued support of military families. Normal banquet noise. Meanwhile, my pulse hadn't slowed once. Mark loosened his collar slightly as we reached the ballroom doors. You sure about this? He asked quietly. I looked at him. No. That surprised a laugh out of him somehow. Not a happy laugh, more like the kind people make when they've run out of ways to pretend they're fine. I kept hoping he admitted that maybe if Dad was proud enough of me, eventually he'd stop needing to control everything. I nodded slowly. Didn't work for me either. That one sat between us for a second. Then the ballroom coordinator spotted me near the entrance. Admiral Miller, she said quickly, relief all over her face. We're ready for senior leadership remarks whenever you are. Thank you. She lowered her voice. And, we received updated authorization paperwork from Navy Personnel Command. Good. The process mattered, especially tonight. I took the folder she handed me and glanced through the revised recognition documents one last time. Official seals, confirmation codes, emergency approval signatures routed through command authority. Everything clean, everything real. No ambush, no stunt, just correction. Mark stared at the paperwork in my hands for a long moment. Then he quietly said, Elena's gonna think she's losing her mind. For about 30 seconds, I said. That finally earned a real smile out of him. Small, tired, honest. The ballroom lights dimmed again as we entered. Conversation softened table by table. People turned toward the stage. I could feel eyes following us now for completely different reasons than earlier. My father was still seated at the center table, but he wasn't working the room anymore. He looked rattled. You could see it in the way he held his shoulders, too stiff, the untouched bourbon near his hand, the forced smile that disappeared every time nobody was looking directly at him. For maybe the first time in his life, Hank Miller didn't understand the room he was sitting in. The Master of Ceremonies returned to the podium, and now he announced, "Admiral Jessica Miller will offer a few remarks before tonight's commendation presentation." Polite applause. I stepped onto the stage, carrying the folder. The ballroom quieted immediately. No notes, no prepared speech, just the truth. I adjusted the microphone slightly. "In naval special warfare," I began, "you learn very quickly that recognition means very little if there isn't integrity behind it." The room settled deeper. I kept my voice calm, not cold, not angry, controlled. "Most acts of courage never make headlines," I continued. "The public usually sees the polished version afterward, the ceremony, the photographs, the speeches." I glanced around the ballroom slowly. But the truth inside those moments matters, especially to the people who were actually there. Nobody moved. Even the waitstaff near the back walls had stopped walking. I saw my father shift slightly in his chair. Then I continued. "Sometimes the quietest person in the room carries the heaviest part of the burden." That line wasn't just about Elena, and maybe part of me knew that. I opened the folder carefully. Following additional operational review completed this evening through Navy command channels, we are issuing updated recognition regarding the rescue operation being honored tonight. Now the room changed. Not loudly. You could just feel people straighten in their chairs. Military people recognize official language immediately. Across the ballroom, my father's face tightened. I kept going. "Petty Officer Elena Ruiz demonstrated exceptional medical leadership and tactical decision-making during extraction operations under extreme conditions. Her actions directly contributed to the survival of multiple personnel during the mission." Murmurs spread quietly across the room, confused whispers turning heads. Then the ballroom side doors opened. Elena Ruiz stepped inside, wearing dress blues, clearly caught off guard. She looked maybe 30 years old, dark hair pulled back tight, sharp posture, completely confused. A commander beside the doorway guided her gently toward the stage. I could practically feel the entire room trying to understand what was happening in real time. Elena reached the front slowly. "Ma'am?" she asked quietly. I smiled faintly. "At ease, Ruiz." That earned the first soft laugh of the evening. Tiny release valve for the tension. I turned back toward the audience. "Some acts of service happen loudly," I said. "Others happen while nobody's paying attention. Tonight, we're correcting that." The ballroom stayed absolutely silent. So silent, I could hear ice settling against glass somewhere near the front tables. Probably my father's. I removed the recognition award from the presentation case. "Elena Ruiz," I said, "on behalf of the United States Navy." Her eyes widened immediately, and suddenly I saw it hit her. Not the medal, the realization that somebody had finally told the truth out loud. I pinned the award carefully onto her uniform while cameras flashed across the ballroom. Elena's eyes filled with tears she was trying very hard not to show. Then something happened I honestly hadn't planned. Mark stood up. The entire room tracked him immediately. He walked slowly toward the stage, every eye in the ballroom locked onto him. My father half rose from his chair. Mark. But Mark kept walking. When he reached us, he looked directly at Elena. Then, in front of everybody, he removed the commendation medal from its case. "You deserve the spotlight first," he said quietly, and he placed the medal into her hands. Not performative, not dramatic, just honest. Elena looked stunned. The ballroom went completely still. Then my father muttered loudly enough for nearby tables to hear, "This isn't what the printed program says." I turned toward him calmly. "The program can always be updated, sir." I paused. The truth should have been there from the beginning. No anger. That was important because anger would have made this personal. Truth made it final. Mark looked out across the ballroom, then back toward our father. His voice shook slightly when he spoke. "Elena saved lives that night. I should have said that sooner." Nobody interrupted him. Nobody defended Hank. That part mattered too. For years, my father controlled rooms through confidence and volume. But once people saw the gap between his version of events and reality, the spell broke fast. That's the thing about authority built on ego. It sounds powerful right up until people stop believing it. Then it collapses almost instantly. The applause started near the back of the ballroom this time. One table, then another, then all of them. People stood not because they were told to, because they wanted to. Elena covered her mouth with one hand, overwhelmed. Mark stepped back beside me quietly, and across the ballroom, my father remained seated, completely alone, at a table full of people. For the first time in my life, I realized my revenge had nothing to do with humiliating him. It was watching the room finally see him clearly. The ceremony finally ended almost 40 minutes later. Military banquets never really stop all at once. They slowly unravel. People linger near the bar. Old officers retell deployment stories. Somebody always asks for one more picture. I stayed longer than I wanted to because Elena kept getting pulled aside by commanders, reporters, and veterans, thanking her personally. She handled it with more grace than most admirals I know. At one point, she leaned toward me and quietly said, "Ma'am, this has been the strangest night of my life." I laughed softly. "You and me both." Mark stayed nearby, but mostly kept to himself. A few people shook his hand respectfully anyway. That surprised him. I think he expected the room to turn on him completely. But older military crowds usually understand the difference between dishonesty and finally correcting it, especially veterans. A retired Marine colonel stopped beside Mark near the dessert table at one point and said, "Takes guts to admit when somebody else carried the heavier load, son." Mark looked like he might cry hearing that. Instead, he just nodded once. Around 10:30, I finally slipped away from the ballroom. The harbor air outside felt colder now. Wind rolled off the water hard enough to cut through my uniform jacket. Valet attendants moved cars beneath the hotel awning while traffic drifted past on Waterside Drive. For the first time all night, things were quiet, at least for about 30 seconds. "Jessica." I turned around. My father was standing near the curb with his hands shoved stiffly into his coat pockets. No audience now, no donors, no retired officers laughing at his jokes. Just us. The valet attendants immediately found somewhere else to look. Hank walked toward me slowly. His face looked older than it had earlier that evening. Not weaker, just tired. "You embarrassed this family tonight," he said. There it was. Not, "You hurt me." Not, "I was wrong." Just reputation, same as always. I folded my arms against the cold. No, I said calmly. I stopped helping you embarrass other people. His jaw tightened immediately. You blindsided your own brother. Mark told the truth. You made him look weak. I actually laughed once at that. Short, sharp. Dad, he looked stronger tonight than he has in 20 years. That hit him harder than yelling would have, because somewhere underneath all that ego, Hank knew it was true. He glanced toward the hotel windows, where people still moved around inside the ballroom. You think those people matter? He asked bitterly. No. Then why humiliate me in front of them? I stared at him for a long moment before answering. Because honestly, I didn't fully understand the answer myself until that second. I didn't do it to humiliate you. He scoffed immediately. Come on. No, I shook my head. I did it because somebody deserved the truth more than you deserved comfort. That shut him up. The harbor wind pushed silence between us for several seconds. Then he tried the old move, the one he'd used my entire life whenever he felt control slipping. Authority. I'm still your father. There it was. I looked at him carefully. Older now, gray around the temples, still standing like a Navy chief inspecting sailors on a pier somewhere in 1987. And for the first time in my entire life, I stopped feeling intimidated by him. Not because of rank, not because of the stars on my shoulders, because I finally understood something. My father had spent decades deciding who people were before they ever had the chance to show him differently. Mark was the son who made him proud. I was the daughter he never fully bothered trying to understand, and he'd held on to those versions of us long after they stopped being true. I'm not cutting you out of my life, I said quietly, but I'm done sitting at tables where being mocked is treated like family humor. He looked stunned by that, not angry, almost confused, like the possibility had never occurred to him. If you want a relationship with me, I continued, it starts with respect. The valet stand behind us stayed completely silent. Even the attendants were pretending not to listen, while absolutely listening. Dad looked away toward the harbor. You always were too sensitive. That one almost got me. Almost, because some small, wounded part of me still reacted to his voice exactly the same way it had when I was 14 years old. But only for a second, then it passed. No, I said softly. I just stopped pretending it doesn't hurt. That landed. I could see it. For a moment, Hank Miller looked like a man standing alone in unfamiliar territory without a map. And strangely enough, I felt sorry for him. Not enough to back down, but enough to finally understand him. He'd spent so many years treating vulnerability like weakness that eventually he couldn't recognize honesty unless it arrived disguised as authority. Neither of us spoke after that. Finally, he nodded once, small, stiff. Then he turned and walked toward the parking garage alone. I watched him go until the darkness swallowed him. A few minutes later, I heard footsteps behind me. Mark. He stood beside me, overlooking the harbor for a while before speaking. You know what's funny? He said. What? I spent half my life jealous of you. I looked at him sideways. Why? He laughed quietly. Because you got away. The honesty in that sentence hit me deep. He rubbed his hands together against the cold. Dad always looked at me like I was carrying the family name. Every mistake felt public. He shook his head slightly. You were the only one who ever escaped becoming what he wanted. I thought about that, because from my side of things, Mark had always been the chosen one, the favorite, the success story. Funny how families work that way. Two kids can survive the exact same house and walk away carrying completely different damage. You know, Mark said carefully, Mom used to say you were the strongest person in the family. I smiled faintly. She also thought Elvis was still alive in Michigan. That got a real laugh out of him, the first genuine one all night. We stood there another minute, watching lights move across the water, and somewhere between the cold air, the silence, and the exhaustion finally catching up to me, I realized something I probably should have learned years earlier. Success doesn't heal rejection. It just makes people think it should. The real change came when I stopped needing my father to confirm my worth before I believed it myself. That was the part that finally set me free. If you've ever spent years trying to earn love or respect from somebody determined not to give it, you probably understand exactly what I mean. Sometimes peace in a family comes from honesty, not silence. And sometimes the strongest thing a person can do is stop shrinking just to fit inside someone else's expectations.